Welcome to Brookline Booksmith author event series. My name is Silas. I'm a member of the events team here at Brookline Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, allow me to extend a warm virtual welcome. We're so excited to have you all here this afternoon to celebrate, or afternoon on the East Coast of the United States, to celebrate the release of On Savage Shores, How Indigenous Americans Discovered Europe, with author Caroline Dodds Pennock in conversation with Andrew Lipman. Andrew Lipman is Associate Professor of History at Barnard College, Columbia University. His first book, The Saltwater Frontier, Indians and the Contest for the American Coast, won the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History. He is presently completing a book about Tisquantum, the Wampanoag man better known as Squanto, who is most famous for helping Mayflower colonists survive their first year in America. Lipman grew up in Brookline, which is where we're located, and is a proud graduate of Pierce Elementary School and Brookline High. Dr. Caroline Dodds Pennock is one of the world's leading authorities on the Aztecs. Trained at Oxford, she's a senior lecturer in international history at the University of Sheffield, and her study of Aztec human sacrifice, Bonds of Blood, won the Royal Historical Society's Gladstone Prize in 2008. She has appeared on history series for the BBC, Netflix, Science Channel, and has written for BBC History Magazine, History Today, and Scientific American. On Savage Shores is a landmark work of narrative history that shatters our previous Eurocentric understanding of the Age of Discovery by telling the story of the Indigenous Americans who journeyed across the Atlantic to Europe after 1492. We have long been taught to presume that the modern global history began when the old world encountered the new, when Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But as Dr. Pennock conclusively shows in her new book, for tens of thousands of Aztecs, Maya, Teutonics, and Inuit and others, enslaved people, diplomats, explorers, servants, and traders, the reverse was true. They discovered Europe. For them, Europe comprised savage shores, a land of riches and marvels, yet perplexing for its brutal disparities of wealth and quality of life and its baffling beliefs. The story of these indigenous Americans abroad is a story of abduction, loss, cultural appropriation, and as they saw it, of apocalypse, a story that has largely been absent from our collective imagination of the times. Drawing on their surviving literature and poetry, and subtly layering European eyewitness accounts against the grain, Pennock gives us a sweeping account of the indigenous American presence in and impact on early modern Europe. Here to tell us more, Andrew Lipman and Caroline Dodds Pennock.
Thank you. Thank you, Silas, so much for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Caroline, for asking me to get this discussion going. I've been hearing about this book for years, and it was such excitement to see it actually show up. And I think it's a real achievement in terms of creativity and clarity of approach. And I think there's a lot to talk about here. But
thank you. I've been writing it for a long time. You're absolutely right. A long, long time.
Telling us a little bit about that process. So what led you to write this book, and how did that process go?
I started, as I said, as a historian of the Aztec world, or of the Mexica, as they would have called themselves. And you spend a lot of time in those sources reading against the grain, always trying to unpick people's experiences from the colonial sources. And so I was working with these colonial sources, and I started to wonder, as a historian of the Mexica world working in Europe, why it was that we heard so much about Europeans traveling west and so little about indigenous people traveling east. There's a famous example which appears briefly in the book. There was a lot more of it in the book, and my editors made me cut it down. So maybe there'll be an article about it. But where Cortes returns to Spain for the first time after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in 1528, and he brings with him an entourage, which includes lots of indigenous people, nobles, entertainers, tumblers, jugglers, what people would have regarded as curiosities, people with congenital deformities, things like this. And that group has been studied sometimes, but people tend to regard them as an exception. as just as if this is a spectacular, unusual thing which doesn't happen very much. But the more I looked, the more I noticed people who are traveling all the time, and I realized that this actually is not an exception. It's, if anything, it's just the tip of the iceberg. You have people traveling back and forth all the time, and I had kind of hoped that by moving forward into the colonial period, I would also stop having just to talk about in the Aztec world, you have very few identifiable individuals because of the nature of the sources. It's all elites. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll be able to study the stories of individual people and trace their lives in the records. And then it turned out that nearly all the sources are not by those people again either, but by people who saw them or spoke to them. And so that was frustrating, but also quite familiar for me to be reading against the grain, unpicking sources for purposes that they weren't written for, trying to use small snippets of information to build up a bigger picture. But it took a long time, not just because I had a daughter in the middle and I changed jobs a couple of times, but also because it was a big shift for me to change. It's not just the sources that change. So I was used to dealing with Mexican codices, and then suddenly you're into 16th century Spanish secretary hand, which, is anybody who's looked at it will know, is just a sort of like a spider crawling across the page much of the time. It's like doing another PhD. And it took a long time. And it also, but I think that was a positive in a way, because it was originally going to be a specialist book, an academic book about Central Americans, Caribbean people going to Spain. And the more I worked on it, the more I sort of realized there was a bigger story here, which wasn't just about these individual histories that had been overlooked, but about how this whole group of people have been overlooked in popular histories and in our wider understandings of the period. So one of the things that was really important for me was trying to change that wider perception of the period, not just telling these individual stories, though they have often been overlooked, and not just recovering those lives, but using them to try and talk about those, to kind of impact on how we view this period in a bigger sense, if that makes sense to me.
Yeah, that's, I mean, so this is actually the sort of the follow-up I was going to ask to that. I think you acknowledge at a few points in your book that this is as an object of study, that these kinds of transatlantic encounters and the movement of indigenous people to Europe is something historians have known about sort of as small phenomenon for a while. And over the last decade in particular, a number of interpretations, mostly by people who study Anglo-American colonization, have started to there's been various work sort of talking a bit about this phenomenon, and of course another important theme of this book, indigenous enslavement. But stepping back to sort of the general reader, someone who might not be keeping up with the latest history books that you and I follow in our field, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions you hope this book in particular would clear up, or new ideas you kind of want to introduce to popular understandings of this period and of indigenous people?
It sounds terribly repetitive, but I think the main one is that these people are not exceptions, they are the rule. And also that these kind of travels start earlier than we often assume. So what work has been done, as you said, tends to focus on the 17th, 18th century. It tends to start with the story of Matoaka, or even end with it, often known as Pocahontas. Her story has been told and retold so many times that her community have asked people to stop talking about her. There's a hashtag, leave Matoaka alone. But people tell that story and they don't tell the other stories. They focus on her life, or they focus on the 18th century and travelers to the British court, things like this. And even then, the stories that have been told tend to focus on these people as spectacular exceptions who are being used as part of European narratives of power, for example. So one of the things I talk about in the book is this incredible Tupi village, which is set up on the banks of the Seine in the middle of the 16th century. And the King of France and all the dignitaries, the nobility of Europe, come to see this incredible village, which they claim has 50 genuine sauvage is the word they use at this place, and also that all the others are sailors who speak Tupinamba, which seems very unlikely that they all are fluent, but we'll let that go. But they've set up this incredible facsimile of an indigenous Brazilian village. Now that has been written about a couple of times, but it's been written about almost exclusively as a story about how this is used to demonstrate European power. It's part of a spectacle about the French versus the Portuguese, about the king's appropriation of indigeneity. And nobody says, what happened to the people? How did the people who were in this village feel about being in this village? How did they get there? Where did they go afterwards? What, why are they there? And that is, as an exemplar, I think, is great because it's part of this bigger story where all across Normandy and northern France, indigenous people are coming all the time. They're traveling very regularly as part of trade, in particular with the Brazil coast, the trade in Brazilwood and in dyes. They are, and also spectacular things like parrots and monkeys and so on. They're coming as part of the, as family members in some cases. They're coming as interpreters, and they're coming over to be baptized. It's just must have been quite a normal sight to see indigenous people in that coastal region at this time. And that's why this big Tupi village is set up on the banks of the Seine, is as part of a negotiation of power around the local cities for who gets the rights to the Brazilwood trade. And so, but nobody goes beyond, or it's quite rare that people go beyond that spectacle. Similarly, there's a wonderful book by Andres Resendez called The Other Slavery, which you surely know, and some people here may well know. It was a trade book, it's done very well, which talks to us about the importance of indigenous enslavement and how maybe 1 million people are being enslaved up to 1600 alone. I'm talking about 1600 because the book basically ends with the founding of Jamestown. One of the things I'm trying to do is to focus on this early period when things are really in flux and indigenous people have real importance as translators and interpreters and go-betweens, and things are a little bit more unstable than and perhaps they are later. And Andres Resendez's book is great. There's been some amazing work on indigenous enslavement by many of our colleagues, but it hasn't really dented people's understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. When people imagine the transatlantic slave trade, they still imagine that it is very much Africans and African descended peoples. They don't think about the fact that tens of thousands as a minimum of indigenous people are coming east to be enslaved in Europe. Now, this, I don't mean this is any kind of, it's not the figures, it's not anywhere near the 12 million people who are traded west from Africa, but it is a sort of shared story with many common themes, and where people are being put into the holds of ships, they're taking their own lives in order to try and avoid being enslaved, or their children being enslaved. You're having people dying in very large numbers because of the brutality. It seems very likely that if we were able to trace that, if someone was to do a lot of very detailed work in the ship's records, that some of the ships that are going west with enslaved Africans are actually coming east with enslaved indigenous people. It's so moving to kind of see this as this, it isn't just a triangle trade, it's a reciprocal trade. And this is something that actually colleagues working on African-American histories were talking to me about recently, that people forget that people go to the Americas and then come back again as well, enslaved African peoples. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you asked me a big question and I've ended up talking about examples, is about trying to shift that broader picture to see. There's been a lot of great work on the histories of Black people in Europe and in Britain. So people by David Olusoga is very well known in Britain. Olivet Orteles, Black Europeans, is amazing. People of color are starting to be seen more in European histories, but indigenous people haven't, that shift hasn't happened yet. I think it's not part of the popular understanding. And also, even to some extent, part of the scholarly understanding. I was doing a podcast with Susanna Lipscomb, who is a wonderful Tudor historian. Tudors are a period we think we know really well, right? But there was a Brazilian king, as they called him, at the court of Henry VIII. And Susanna didn't know that. And this isn't hidden knowledge. It's published, it's in Hakluyt, which, for those people who don't know, is a very, very well-known collection of travel records. So it's not hidden knowledge, but it hasn't become part of our conception of this period in a kind of popular sense. And that's what I'm hoping to change.
Yeah, I think you got at something that I wanted to sort of talk, because I used the first chapter of the body of the book is about slavery, and I think that gets woven in, will come back again throughout the entire narrative analysis of your book. So I'm really glad you raised that. And I also think just not to go totally off track here. I know you actually spend a fair amount of time on Twitter, and someone showed me, I quit that a while ago. Someone showed me a tweet from last.
I wondered where you'd gone.
No, I had enough of it. But a tweet from, someone who's has put herself at the forefront of being kind of popular historian of slavery, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the person behind the 1619 Project, asking the question, I think reasonably, because it wasn't what she was interested in, but asking, were many Native Americans taken to Europe as slaves?
Wow.
And someone showed me this tweet, and it was from last year. She's been working on this project for several years. And, you could, I don't mean this as a criticism of her in particular, but simply the fact that you could be very involved in the study of slavery. And unless you are in particular halls of academia, you not necessarily know just how much work is being done, how significant this phenomena is, which only speaks, I think, to the centrality of your work here. And aside from this sort of major part about enslavement, which I think is there, are there other sort of just large, along with the transshipment of people unwillingly as slaves, other sort of particular individual stories or reasons that people are crossing the ocean that you thought were really important for readers to know about and that hasn't broken through to a larger readership?
Yeah, I think people maybe do have a sense of Indigenous people as go-betweens and translators. So you're writing about Tisquantum, who's better known as Squanto, people like this. The interesting thing is that it's almost at the two ends of the spectrum where the sources are richest and where people seem to know least about it. So people who are enslaved, and then elites. Diplomats in Europe are incredibly common, Indigenous diplomats. You have people going back and forth to the Spanish court and then later to the British court all the time. People coming to appeal for their families, for their cities, for their communities, asking for grants, asking for the confirmation of rights, asking for various rewards and benefits. So Indigenous people would have been quite a common sight at court as well. We see them depicted in some images of the court. And again, I think people don't think that. We take for granted now, I hope, that Indigenous people aren't passive subjects of invasion, that they negotiate, they resist, they're agents in their own destiny. But people tend to think of that happening in the colonies, I think, on the fringes of the empire, not at the heart of empire. Even though Cole Thrush has a wonderful book called Indigenous London. I think most people, which deserves you better, and if you are interested in this subject, obviously buy my book first and then buy, God, I'm joking. It's a really good book. And he talks about it right up to the 20th century in different kinds of Indigenous people. So from Polynesian people, Aboriginal people as well. So again, there's a scholarly sense that some of this travel is happening, but very much, I don't think most people, when they picture European courts, picture Indigenous diplomats as part of that scene. Also as family members. Now, most commonly it's mestizo or mixed heritage people who are coming to Europe as family members, because the Spanish crown keeps trying very hard to ban the travel of purely Indigenous people. They don't do very well at banning it, but they keep trying to ban it. But you have a lot of mixed heritage people coming to Europe, and that travel is being encouraged by the crown because they think they can indoctrinate them and then send them back. I should say the book isn't just about Spain and Portugal, but I do talk a reasonable amount about that because that's where a lot of the travel is happening in this early period. So it's almost like a balance between a lot of travelers to Spain and Portugal, and then more, and then also to the northern coast of France and around there, and then smaller groups that tend to be more, what's the word I'm looking for, more seen as more curiosities or spectacles or exemplars to other regions. So you have Inuit people going to Britain and they're being taken. And this is a theme that underlies the book. You mentioned slavery, but also the various kinds of coercion that are going on to bring Indigenous people to Europe. And sometimes it's hidden behind words like they were brought or they were taken, and we don't know if they're voluntarily traveling or are being coerced. I think that you were asking about other kinds of travelers. I think lots. I think the involvement of Indigenous people as well in the bringing of stuff. So we often know about stuff. You know, we know that chocolate comes from the Americas, or potatoes or tomatoes, though I don't think everybody knows that. But I think a lot of people in Europe know that. but we don't think about Indigenous people being involved in the bringing of these things. These stories are often told alongside the stories of European explorers. So the famous one in Britain here is that Francis Drake brings tobacco and potatoes from the Americas, but Francis Drake hasn't even, there are people eating potatoes and smoking tobacco in Europe long before Francis Drake ever thinks about going west. So it's all become entangled with these stories of the great explorers, and Indigenous people's involvement in these reciprocal networks just gets lost, I think. Also how early we have travelers, you know, sorry, I could just go on, couldn't I? But like when Columbus returns from the Americas for the first time, he brings native people with him, you know, and that's, people think about Columbus going and discovering the Americas, but they don't think about those first discoverers of Europe.
There's so many great points that you've made here that I want to expand upon, but I actually think that what you just brought up and what you were saying before about the example is a really memorable part of the book. I think people haven't read it yet. They're going to really enjoy the account of this village near Rouen in France that you talk about. In both these examples, what you're talking about is something that we historians usually call reading against the grain, right? You have a source written by a colonial observer for the direction of their needs and their impressions and their cultural prerogative shaping everything in that, and how historians, by what means we look at a source and try to consider, okay, well, what is going on here for the people being objectified? If we put them as subjects, how does that do that? And I think you use several different ways of approaching a source and thinking about Indigenous perspectives. And I think you use a number of different kinds of sources to tell this story. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit. I think for people who don't study Indigenous history, there's an assumption, well, what are your sources? Since the majority of people you're talking about, some example do have their own written languages. Most people do not, or have their language is much more symbolic and using a lot of different objects, not, you know, characters for sounds. But how you tell that story, what kind of sources you're working, maybe some moments where you felt you were able to really get against the grain and tell us something new. Yeah,
I guess I want to start by saying that I do say in the book that, as you say, that you often have to read against the grain, and that and I've said the majority of our sources seem to be by people who either kidnapped or met or just happened upon the Indigenous people, or account records, for example, that tell us something about where they were or what they were eating or what they were wearing, but not about their experience of that, how they felt about it, how they saw it. Now, I'm not saying that there are no sources for Indigenous histories or for Indigenous perspectives. I think that's incredibly important to emphasize. There are many sources for them, but the sources specifically for travelers are quite thin on the ground, with the exception of the two ends of the spectrum. So for enslaved people, we have some quite rich records that are freedom suits, where they're appealing for their freedom, having been illegally enslaved. And in the top end, I mentioned the diplomats, and of course they are literate and they write letters, petitions, accounts of their own experiences. For something in the middle, like you mentioned the village at Rouen, we often are finding ourselves having to work with simply accounts of people who saw what was there, and then to zoom out and try and think carefully around them, if that makes sense. So the village at Rouen, of course, was an incredible spectacle at the time. There are several formal records and some pictographic records. So first you look at what is said about it, how many people are there, where they might be from. And then I looked at the images that came with these spectacles, and I tried to think about whether these might be real reflections. I looked at so there's a battle takes place between two groups of Indigenous people, and one side allied with a fake Portuguese force, and one side allied with the French force. And of course the French win, because this is a French spectacle. And so I went and I looked at what the relationships were between the Indigenous people at the time in the Americas, between the Portuguese and the French. This is always seen through the Europeans playing this out, but of course the Indigenous people also were playing out these relationships in the Americas and these diplomatic interactions. I looked at the fact that, which is often again overlooked, the fact that they're engaged in the Brazilwood trade. So before the battle breaks out, there were all these people cutting down fake Brazilwood trees. So we look at what they're actually doing, and then how Indigenous people are involved in the Brazilwood trade. And that takes you to some other sources, which are friezes showing indigenous peoples in Rouen and in other cities. It also takes you to the records only a few years later in Rouen. Michel de Montaigne, who wrote an essayist, who wrote a famous article called On the Cannibals, he claims that it's in Rouen, 3 years after the spectacle, that he met 3 cannibals and talked to them in detail about their lives and what things were like. Now, he's making a point about European society, but there's also absolutely no good reason he could not have met these people and talked to them. And so we have their recorded voices of indigenous people. You have, and for me, it's also the fact that you then have some fragments in archives that show that indigenous people at this time were living in Rouen and in villages around there that tell us only that they were being baptized. Now, they may have nothing to do with the village spectacle, but that means that they also are being part of becoming part of everyday life in that part of France. You know, there are lots of different ways that you can come into it, if that makes sense. That is not the best example of how it's possible to show indigenous perspectives. That's in a chapter where you end up inevitably thinking about very much reading against the grain, where there are some examples where we have more sources by the people in question. But it's really, really just about incredibly close reading and thinking, well, I don't know. I never, someone, a very good review, I got a good review. And the criticism was that I used words like might and perhaps and maybe too much. And a historian I admire very much, actually, whose book I'm reading right now, he says, I'm not going to use too many of those kinds of words. I'm just going to assume that you know that this can't all be certain, and I'm going to put it in the endnotes. For me, I felt, especially as a white British historian trying to represent indigenous voices, that it was incredibly important to show what I did know and where I was speculating. You know, I didn't feel like I have the authority to speak for indigenous people in any way. And so, without making it really boring, I do think you have to. So someone else had said, oh, it's too much speculation. I should probably tell you the good reviews rather than the bad reviews, but you know, someone else said there's too much speculation. But either you don't attempt to access these voices and you just say, well, we can't tell that history, or you try, you say, look, well, we know, for example, so there's a little snip, I mentioned account records. So we sometimes have accounts that show, especially, for example, we put up these people in this place and here's what they were, how much was paid for them and who was looking after them and what clothes were bought for them. And there's, in one of the accounts, it says that a doctor was paid to bleed some Nahua nobles who were in Seville. And that's the 1528 group. Now, how would these men who 7 years before were part of a religion where you bleed people for religious purposes to let blood for the gods, how would they have felt about a doctor coming along and saying, right, I'm just going to let blood from you to cure you? I don't know, but that seems like a moment when you get a little window into something that must have been incredibly interesting, you know, provocative. I mean, would they have thought back to their previous religion? Would that have seemed therefore completely logical to them as a curing tool, or you're appealing to the gods? Or, you know, would they have seen it as very strange? Or so you can do some speculation. It's informed speculation, but it is speculation in some cases. Sometimes.
I appreciate you making that distinction here. And I think actually this is something, you know, obviously because methodologically I sort of tread in some of the same area you do as well. What I often feel is, yes, I think it is, for all the reasons you said, important, particularly, you know, if you don't want to end up with ventriloquizing, a word that you use as well. You don't want to be the historian fully assuming the perspective of your historical subject. That actually, it's not that people like you and me who write about, you know, sort of read against the grain, who use might perhaps too much. It's actually probably historians who might think they have more sources of information who don't use it enough. I often feel that these problems of indeterminate motives and having to eventually kind of create and occupy an unknowable headspace, that's something every historian does. And it's
Yeah.
whether you're writing about a president or a peasant, it's that we actually all do that, and that what you're actually doing is a little more of highlighting the indeterminacy and what we don't know. And that's actually, I think, something that's an important contribution of this book, especially for inviting people who are new to considering this history.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that the crossover between academic and trade writing there's been a lot of good work which starts to show that speculation a little bit more in trying to go beyond your sources. I think that can be really positive.
I think you do something really interesting. I thought was one of these, whenever I read a book like this, I'm always thinking, well, what are the chapters I'm going to, maybe teach with and do that. I think what you do in the chapter on objects is really interesting. And I'm thinking of other studies that somewhat do this work of people being crossed. They don't always bring in objects in particular as things that are traveling with people. And then I think really importantly, what you do is you look at objects as carrying ideas and systems of values with them that we're so accustomed often if you're coming at this from a Eurocentric lens, to think about the objects of the Americas as commodities, as kind of being folded into European culture and society. And you often try to place various objects, whether they are gifts at the ceremonial, whether they're crafted or whether they're harvested or collected, these various objects within the societies that are producing them and creating them, and using larger ethnographic knowledge to help us read what's happening when an object trades hands, and again, reconstructing in sort of collective indigenous perspectives on what is moving around. I was also struck too, this is one of many issues, I don't want to get too much in present day resonances, but you talk a lot about repatriation in various sort of points, and the problem of another westward transit now of many indigenous peoples identifying, speaking up, and asking for the return of objects held in European hands and in European institutions. Is that, I guess one sort of question I had, just sort of thinking about that, is that tension evident in some of these 16th century sources of not wanting to see something go? Is that something you can kind of unearth here, or that you found examples of, that kind of tension and conflict? Can you see that in the sources, or is this something that we kind of have to assume looking back?
I wish I could see that more. There are some places where people quite blatantly just take stuff without asking, but because the sources for these things are usually written by Europeans, it's quite rare that any very deliberate theft or resistance to the taking of stuff is shown. I mean, this chapter was one of the I found it one of the hardest to write, because I thought it would be one of the easiest. So you start out and you say, oh, one of the obvious ways that indigenous peoples influence European culture and society is through stuff, is through commodities, foods, plants, animals, all these things. And then I realized that the sources that we've got don't reflect very well the interaction between indigenous peoples and that stuff. We know that they're there, we know that they're involved with it, but very frequently the two are very detached in the sources, even in the language we use. So the book proposal, originally this chapter, which my agent came up with, it was called Chilies and Chocolate, and I never liked the title, and I wanted to call it Stuff, and stuff isn't very eloquent either. And eventually I came up with the Stuff of Life, and I was so pleased when I finally came up with a title that worked, because one of the things I wanted to do is to point out that words like commodities and products immediately frame all of these things that are crossing the Atlantic within a narrative of the market, within a narrative of money and trade, and that it inherently is Eurocentric in the way it thinks about them. Now, I'm not saying that indigenous people didn't have trade. Of course, indigenous peoples have trade. Nor am I saying that no Europeans had worldviews that went beyond the market. Of course not. But Europeans tend to commodify the stuff of the Americas in a much greater, more obvious way. And they're much more acquisitive, even about people. We will take these things. Oh, look, there's gold to be found here. There's profit to be found here. Indigenous communities, very often when you do see the things crossing the Atlantic, they're not seeing them as products in the sense of a trade good. So we have a famous example of our pot bats who crosses the Atlantic. He's a Maya lord, he comes with a group of other Maya lords to the court of Prince Philip II, who is soon to become, court of Prince Philip, who is soon to become King Philip II. And they bring with them, one of the really interesting things is they're the first people recorded making drinking chocolate in Europe. Now, there is one earlier record of cocoa beans being brought, cacao beans being brought, but no records of them actually being drunk or used. And the first record of drinking chocolate in Europe is this group of Maya lords. And that's amazing and fascinating in its own right, that this is the beginnings of this become so pervasive in European culture and in our society now of chocolate, global commodity, all of these things. But the thing that they value is the feathers. They bring thousands of quetzal feathers with them. And that is what is recorded in the indigenous accounts of the voyage. It's not the chocolate, it's not the platters and the foods, the gourds and the squashes and so on that they bring. It's the feathers. Now, feathers are valued in European culture as a kind of trade good, but not in the way that the indigenous people are doing. And you literally see in the indigenous record, which has been handed down, Ashley Kistler did amazing community anthropological work, and they shared with her a record that has been copied by indigenous communities kind of generation after generation, in which it says really specifically which community was responsible for how many feathers. That's what they care about. And feathers in this community have so much spiritual symbolic value, so much to do with the gods, to do with generational power, to do with spiritual power. And this is an embassy which is at court ostensibly to ask for more missionaries and stuff for a church. And they are here presenting this incredible wealth of spiritual riches to a group of kind of Catholic nobles. It's a really, the tension is really evident there. And so one of the things I tried to do in the chapter is to say, look, we can look at these things as beyond just commodities, just products. Now, I don't want to simplify, but indigenous communities do not tend to view material wealth in the same way as Europeans at this time, on average, you know. So even in a society like the Aztecs, which has extreme disparities of kind of lifestyle, they still do not conceive of the idea that some people will live in poverty. There are communal grain stores, there are mechanisms of redistribution of wealth. If you think about the potlatch up in what is now Canada, indigenous communities, they talk about how the wealthiest people are those that can give away the most. It's we have very few sources that actually tell us what indigenous people thought about Europeans at this time, about Europe, not Europeans in general, but travel to Europe. But some of the very few that we do have suggest that the inequalities are the biggest thing. And this is reflected again later by later travelers. They always pick up on these inequalities. They're like, why aren't you burning down these palaces? How can you be in poverty outside this? You know, it's the vast inequities is one of the things that comes up over and over. And so I wanted to really try and, yes, it generalizes a little bit, doesn't it, to say indigenous peoples think in this way, Europeans think in this way. Of course it does. But the whole point is to try and flip the script so that you're coming at it from a different point of view, that reading against the grain, but on a bigger scale.
Yeah, that's great. I see we're at 40 minutes. I don't know if Silas want to jump in here and open the floor to viewers. Hello.
Hello.
So you go to Q&A?
Yeah, definitely. So I see that we already have some questions in the chat. Feel free to drop additional ones, any of our viewers, but I'll just go ahead and start with the first one from Dave. He says, let's see, I'm gonna give these pronunciations the old college try. You mentioned the word is MESTIZOS in Spain. How does that relate to Limpieza de Sangre and their reception?
So for people who don't know, Limpieza de Sangre means purity of blood. It's you have these purity of blood laws. And the mestizos are the mixed heritage children. Technically, a mestizo is half white and half indigenous, but it's a word that's come to mean people of all kinds of mixed heritage as well, but technically half white and half indigenous. Now, at this time, so as the 16th century goes on, Spain is becoming obsessed with purity of blood, because what they've done in 1492 is to tell all Jewish people that they should either get out or convert to Christianity. And this seems like a good idea to start with. And then they realize that this means they might have a fifth column of kind of hidden Jewish people within their community. So they're most worried at the beginning about crypto-Judaism, about people who, what they call new Christians, people who haven't been Christian very long. And that is the beginnings of all kinds of racist thought which develop later, or at least not the beginning, but it pushes forward racist thought around purity. Now, the interesting thing about mestizos is that even when they send the Inquisition to the Americas, they're not particularly interested in indigenous people. It's all about Protestants and Jewish people. Now, what's most interesting is that what they seem to care most about is people's birth in this early period. So as long as you're noble, it doesn't really seem to matter that much. In fact, Cortez's mestizo son, Martin, who he has with the famous, she's called Malintzin, you might know her as Doña Marina or La Malinche, his indigenous translator, his illegitimate son Martin goes to Europe with him in 1528, that expedition we talked about, takes his small son with him, and he manages to get his son, who is a mixed heritage child, into the Order of Santiago, which is the highest, most elite order in Spain. And it's on the basis that his father's a conquistador and his mother is a noble indigenous woman who helped with the conquest. So it's all about nobility. The Spanish, their position in the Americas is quite unstable at this point, and they're trying to justify it against all sorts of other people. And one of the ways they do it is by intermarrying with and allying with the indigenous nobility, who they call the señores naturales, the natural lords of the land. You see their recognition of nobility in the fact that when embassies come, they start to pay people to be supported in the manner to which their birth entitles them. And so with the children of Inca nobility, for example, they're paying out thousands and thousands to support these groups in the manner to which their calidad, their quality, entitles them. Now, that's not to say that indigenous people will have experienced no prejudice, no bias, no racism, but it seems to be an awful lot more about your birth and whether you're Christian than it does about purity of blood, at least in the earlier period. In the colonies, you see the development. You may have seen these casta paintings where there's between 16 and 32, usually, images showing people's mixed heritage. And as the period goes on, your purity of blood becomes a much bigger deal. But in this early period, proximity to power gives you an awful lot of clout despite your birth. So yeah, it's really fascinating how little, in some ways, your heritage seems to matter in this period if we're talking about blood laws. And they're never actually bound into the blood laws. It's never an issue. Yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting. We have a question from Dr. Brown. Is there evidence of indigenous peoples of the Americas selling individuals to Europeans into slavery that occurred frequently in the African slave trade?
Some evidence, but not very much, because in this period, there are 3 justifications for being enslaved in Spanish law. So in 1542, they bring in a thing called the New Laws, which bans the enslavement of indigenous people under any circumstances, because they are vassals. They're considered to be vassals and potential Christians. I guess just to explain, the Spanish justification for their invasion of the Americas is almost exclusively a papal bull that the Pope grants in 1493 called the Bull of Inter Caetera, in which he says you can have these lands on condition you evangelize them. And so they have to accept that these people can be evangelized and are fully human. The Pope declares them fully human again in 1537. They keep doing it because of course, there's plenty of prejudice and attempts to exploit these people. But in 1542, this is made illegal. So before that point, you can't just go around enslaving people. You can only enslave people under one of three justifications. You can enslave people if they're cannibals, if they are captured in a just war, and then you're into, of course, what is a just war, or a thing called rescate, which means being rescued from a worse fate. And in that case, that usually means either being a sacrificial victim or being enslaved to someone who isn't a Christian. Because, of course, it must be worse to be enslaved to someone who's not a Christian than to be enslaved to a Christian. And so there isn't actually an incentive to buy people from indigenous peoples, because you take them, you rescue them into your, into your custody. And these are very exploited, these loopholes, enormously exploited, despite the laws. I don't want to go in, there's so many different laws about slavery, I don't want to go into them into a lot of detail, but to answer your question, slavery does exist in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. It tends to be very different in that, like African slavery, it is almost exclusively of out groups rather than in groups. You enslave foreigners, not people from within your own community, which is what happens later on in Africa. But so you enslave people from out groups, and usually it's not chattel slavery. And what I mean by that is you can't be murdered, you retain the right to your person, to your body, your children are born free, you can marry, you can hold property. It's more like unwaged labor than it is what we think of as slavery now. So there are some cases, but not many that I'm aware of, not in this early period anyway. Later on, of course, it's a whole other ballgame, and there's been amazing work by other colleagues about internal trading. Very often Europeans just go round, they're not really interested in trading with local communities for enslaved people, they just seize people more often than not.
Thank you. And if anyone else would like to drop a question in the Q&A box, you're welcome to. In the meantime, Andrew, if you have any closing questions, we have a couple minutes.
Yeah, well, I just have one question. I feel one thing I like about this book is that, you do a lot of balancing of the big and the general with carefully letting in the exceptions in a way that I think is very hard to do well. And I also like how you do, when you find an individual who's compelling, try to reinscribe their story. And I was wondering, in doing this process, was there any sort of individual you met or a couple individuals who, telling their story, surprised you, opened up something new, you found something just kind of profound in trying to tell their story?
I guess, I don't know about profound, but the one that sticks with me the most is the story of the Inuit people who come to London, or rather are brought to London. There are 3 Inuit people buried in London that everyone always forgets about. And one of those is a little baby. And he is so I was going to say his parents, but they're not his parents. So there are 3 Inuit people are brought to London by Frobisher in the 1570s. And they're not the first Inuit in London, there've been 2 before, but they come as a group and they're brought to Bristol. And their names are Arnak, Nutak, and Calico. And Nutak just means baby, and Arnak means woman, and Calico seems to be his actual name. Now, Calico is not the father of the baby, but Arnak and Nutak are a family. And John White, whose pictures of indigenous people you may have seen, he drew the Inuit who came. And there's a fabulous picture of Arnak and Nutak, and the baby is in her hood, and you can just see his little face peeking out from her hood. And they come to Bristol, and they are seen as a spectacle. And there's this kind of amazing vignette where Calico is harpooning ducks on the Avon to show how they harpoon seals. The Avon is the river. But quite soon after they arrive, Arnak and Calico both die, possibly of measles. Calico, at least has internal injuries of some kind from when he's captured. He dies first. And his doctor, because it's incredible, we have the autopsy records preserved of the two indigenous people. He diagnoses him with Anglophobia. He says that he's died of Anglophobia, of phobia of England. And actually the description he gives is of a man who is putting on a brave face, but is in unbearable pressure and terrible pain and under dreadful circumstances. And he dies, and he then autopsies him, and then forces Arnett to witness his burial, the burial of his dismembered body, to prove that he's not a cannibal. He wants her to not believe they're cannibals. And I mean, he interprets her passivity during this as kind of lack of emotion, but it sounds much more like a woman who's in absolute shock. And she dies not long after, and is also buried at Bristol. They're buried in the grounds of a church in Bristol. And they take the baby, who, well, I say baby, he's probably a toddler, to London, where he is put on show, it seems, at a London pub, and he survives 8 days and dies probably again of the measles that likely killed his mother, and is buried in the grounds of a church called St. Olave's, which still stands in the city of London. And people walk past this every day and have no idea that he's one of not just one, but 2 Inuit who are buried in the grounds of this church. It's completely unmarked. But people go there to see the grave of Samuel Pepys, a man about whom we know almost every single thing, including lots of things we probably didn't want to know about him. You know, he's a dreadful man, the things we know about Samuel Pepys. And he's buried really close to where the same church where Nutak, the baby, is buried. And for me, that juxtaposition of this tiny baby about whom we know almost nothing, who people don't just walk past every day and don't realize that his story is one of so many thousands of indigenous people whose bones lie in Europe, with that juxtaposition with then Samuel Pepys, who everybody knows about, just exemplified for me the stories that I'm trying to tell, you know. And it's not just incredibly moving, the story of this little baby and the little face peeking past his mother's head, but also just absolutely nails the kind of contrast between the stories that we can tell and do tell and spend our time telling, that we hear over and over again, and those that we have to look really hard to find and to emphasize. So that was the one that really stuck with me. Though I'm not sure that was exactly your question.
No, that was great. I love that example. I think there's one more question, right?
Yeah, one more question. This is from Sarah. It'll be our last question. And this is sort of a big question. I feel like we just ended on a good point, but and I know that you're sort of an expert on this upcoming question, because the question is, can you provide any perspective on the gender aspects of this history of transatlantic interactions? That could be a whole nother hour. But if you want to give us just a tidbit, and then I'm sure if you follow Dr. Pennock on Twitter or other places, she'll continue to provide analysis on that.
You too, yes. Yeah, so I was very glad when a colleague said they particularly liked that I'd managed to find some women in the book, because I feel like I started as a gender historian. I feel like I had to work really hard often to find women in this story. So in terms of slavery, you actually get quite a lot of women, because unlike with the transatlantic trade, which in particular tends to favor young men, women and children are favored for their greater sexual availability. This is a domestic enslavement ordinarily in Europe. And so you get quite a lot of enslaved women coming to Europe. And then you have some spouses, partners of Spaniards coming. Far fewer women as go-betweens, translators, as part of spectacles, and so on. Although you do see some Inuit women coming. There's an incredible pamphlet, and it's all we know about this pair is an Inuit woman and her child who's put on display in the Low Countries in Antwerp. And it claims that her husband, I think, had eaten 12 men. And it's very sensationalized, this pamphlet, but you get this, again, this incredible picture of the two of them that just is really striking. So I guess it often is men, if you're thinking about elites and go-betweens and spectacles, but there's actually quite a lot of women when you're looking at the transatlantic trade in enslaved Indigenous people, and also when you're thinking about exception, or when you're thinking about spouses, because it's much more common for a Spanish man to have an Indigenous partner than it is for a Spanish woman to have an Indigenous male partner. It's much more common that way around. So yeah, there's quite a bit on gender, but not as much as I would like, because I want there to be more women, but women tend to be hidden in the sources. So with the Cortez, this is my last thing I'll say, I promise. The Cortez expedition that we've been, because just to come back to that, the 1528 expedition, all of the recorded names are men. But then in this costume book that records pictures of people, stylized pictures of people from life from that period, there's a woman depicted. But she's not depicted wearing anything she would actually have worn. So we don't know if he's just included her for completeness, so he has a men and a woman, or if there actually was a woman, because the gloss next to it says that she's one of the women that came with, she's one of the Indigenous people that came with Cortez, and this is the only woman that came out, is what the gloss says. So maybe there was a woman there, we don't know.
Well, thank you so much for providing this analysis, and also for giving us more open-ended questions to think about as well. I think this is just the beginning of more puzzle pieces being put into this new lens. And I'm going to drop I just put the link to buy the book. You can use this link up until 9 a.m. tomorrow. We highly encourage you to do so if you want to learn more. Thank you to both of our authors and professors. Thanks
Thank you
for
for
everyone.
the invitation, just to say.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone for coming in the questions.
Yeah, thank you for everyone for coming around the globe, and for our attendees. And again, the link is in the chat, and have a great afternoon or evening or wherever you happen to be.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.